Lives of the Most Eminent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects by Giorgio Vasari.
Life of Raffaello da Urbino, Raffaello Sanzio, Part 2. At this same time he painted a panel containing Our Lady, St. Jerome, robed as a cardinal, and an angel Raphael, accompanying Tobias, which was placed in San Domenico at Naples, in that chapel wherein is the crucifix that spoke to St. Thomas Aquinas. For Signor Leonardo da Carpi, Lord of Meldola, who is still alive, although more than 90 years old, he executed a picture that was most marvelous in coloring, and of a singular beauty, for it is painted with such force, and also with a delicacy so pleasing, that I do not think it is possible to do better. In the countenance of the Madonna may be seen such a divine air, and in her attitude such a beauty, that no one would be able to improve her. And he made her with the hands clasped, adoring her son, who is seated on her knee, caressing a St. John, a little boy who is adoring him, in company with St. Elizabeth and Joseph. This picture was once in the possession of the very Reverend Cardinal da Carpi, son of the said Signor Leonello, and a great lover of our arts, and it should be at the present day in the hands of his heirs. Afterwards, Lorenzo Pucci, Cardinal of Santi Quattro, having been created Grand Penitentiary, Raffaello was favored by him with a commission to paint a panel for San Giovanni in Monte at Bologna, which is now set up in the chapel wherein lies the body of the Blessed Elena dall'Olio, in which work it is evident how much grace, in company with art, could accomplish by means of the delicate hands of Raffaello. In it is a Santa Cecilia, who, entranced by a choir of angels on high, stands listening to the sound, wholly absorbed in the harmony, and in her countenance is seen that abstraction which is found in the faces of those who are in ecstasy. Scattered about the ground, moreover, are musical instruments, which have the appearance of being not painted, but real and true, and such also are some veils that she is wearing, with vestments woven in silk and gold, and below these a marvelous hair shirt. And in St. Paul, who has the right arm leaning on his naked sword, and the head resting on the hand, one sees his profound air of knowledge, no less well expressed than the transformation of his pride of aspect into dignity. He is clothed in a simple red garment by way of mantle, below which is a green tunic, after the manner of the apostles, and his feet are bare. There is also St. Mary Magdalene, who is holding in her hands a most delicate vase of stone, in an attitude of marvelous grace. Turning her head, she seems full of joy at her conversion, and indeed, in that kind of painting, I do not think that anything better could be done. Very beautiful likewise are the heads of St. Augustine and St. John the Evangelist. Of a truth, other pictures may be said to be pictures, but those of Raffaello, life itself. For in his figures, the flesh quivers, the very breath may be perceived, the pulse beats, and the true presentment of life is seen in them, on which account this picture gave him, in addition to the fame that he had already, an even greater name. Wherefore many verses were written in his honor, both Latin and in the vulgar tongue, of which, in order not to make my story longer than I have set out to do, I will cite only the following. Pingit sola alii referantque, coloribus ora, caeciliae as Raphael atque animum explicuit. After this, he also painted a little picture with small figures, which is likewise at Bologna, in the house of Count Vincenzo Ercolano, containing a Christ after the manner of Jove in heaven, surrounded by the four evangelists as Ezekiel describes them, one in the form of a man, another as a lion, the third an eagle, and the fourth an ox, with a little landscape below to represent the earth, which work in its small proportions is no less rare and beautiful than his others in their greatness. To the Counts of Canossa in Verona he sent a large picture of equal excellence, in which is a very beautiful nativity of our Lord, with a daybreak that is much extolled, as is also the St. Anne, and indeed the whole work, which cannot be more highly praised than by saying that it is by the hand of Raffaello da Urbino. Wherefore those counts rightly hold it in supreme veneration, nor have they ever consented, for all the vast prices that have been offered to them by many princes, to sell it to any one. For Bindo Altoviti he made a portrait of him when he was a young man, which is held to be extraordinary, and likewise a picture of Our Lady, which he sent to Florence, and which is now in the palace of Duke Cosimo, in the chapel of the new apartments, which were built and painted by me, where it serves as altarpiece. In it is painted a very old Saint Anne seated and holding out to Our Lady her Son, the features of whose countenance, as well as the whole of his nude form, are so beautiful that with his smile he rejoices whoever beholds him. Besides which, Raffaello depicted, in painting the Madonna, all the beauty that can be imparted to the aspect of a virgin, with the complement of chaste humility in the eyes, honor in the brow, grace in the nose, and virtue in the mouth. Not to mention that her raiment is such as to reveal infinite simplicity and dignity. And indeed, I do not think that there is anything better to be seen than this whole work. There is a nude St. John seated with a female saint, who is likewise very beautiful, and for the background there is a building in which he painted a linen-covered window that gives light to the room wherein are the figures. In Rome, he made a picture of good size in which he portrayed Pope Leo, Cardinal Giulio de' Medici, and Cardinal de' Rossi. In this, the figures appear to be not painted but in full relief. There is the pile of the velvet, with the damask of the Pope's vestments, shining and rustling, the fur of the lining soft and natural, and the gold and silk so counterfeited that they do not seem to be in color but real gold and silk. There is an illuminated book of parchment, which appears more real than the reality, and a little bell of wrought silver, which is more beautiful than words can tell. Among other things also is a ball of burnished gold on the Pope's chair, wherein are reflected, as it were a mirror, such is its brightness, the light from the windows, the shoulders of the Pope, and the walls round the room. And all these things are executed with such diligence that one may believe, without any manner of doubt, that no master is able, or is ever likely to be able, to do better. For this work the Pope was pleased to reward him very richly, and the picture is still to be seen in Florence, in the guardaroba of the Duke. In like manner, he executed portraits of Duke Lorenzo and Duke Giuliano, with a perfect grace of coloring not achieved by any other than himself, which are in the possession of the heirs of Ottaviano de' Medici at Florence. Thereupon there came to Raffaello a great increase of glory, and likewise of rewards, and for this reason, in order to leave some memorial of himself, he caused a palace to be built in the Borgo Nuovo at Rome, which Bramante executed with castings. Now the fame of this most noble craftsman, by reason of the aforesaid works, and many others, having passed into France and Flanders, Albrecht Dürer, a most marvellous German painter and an engraver of very beautiful copper plates, rendered tribute to Raffaello out of his own works, and sent to him a portrait of himself, a head, executed by him in gouache, on a cloth of fine linen, which showed the same on either side, the lights being transparent and obtained without lead white, while the only grounding and coloring was done with watercolors, the white of the cloth serving for the ground of the bright parts. This work seemed to Raffaello to be marvellous, and he sent him, therefore, many drawings executed by his own hand, which were received very gladly by Albrecht. That head was among the possessions of Giulio Romano, the heir of Raffaello in Mantua. Raffaello, having thus seen the manner and the engravings of Albrecht Dürer, and desiring on his own behalf to show what could be done with his work by such an art, caused Marcantonio Bolognese to make a very thorough study of the method, and that master became so excellent that Raffaello commissioned him to make prints of his first works, such as the drawing of the Innocents, a Last Supper, the Neptune, and the Santa Cecilia being boiled in oil. Marcantonio afterwards made for Raffaello a number of other engravings, which Raffaello finally gave to Baviera, his assistant, who had charge of a mistress whom Raffaello loved to the day of his death. Of her he made a very beautiful portrait, wherein she seemed wholly alive. And this is now in Florence, in the possession of that most gentle of men, Matteo Batti, a Florentine merchant, and an intimate friend of every able person, and particularly of painters, who treasures it as a relic, on account of the love that he bears to art, and above all to Raffaello. And no less esteem is shown to the works of our arts and to the craftsmen by his brother, Simon Batti, who, besides being held by us all to be one of the most loving spirits that show favor to the men of our professions, is held in estimation by me in particular as the best and greatest friend that ever man loved, after a long experience, not to mention the good judgment that he has and shows in matters of art. But to return to the engravings, the favor shown by Raffaello to Baviera was the reason that there afterwards sprang up Marco da Ravenna and a host of others, insomuch that the dearth of copper engravings was changed into that abundance that we see at the present day. Thereupon Ugo da Carpi, having a brain inclined to ingenious and fanciful things, and showing beautiful invention, discovered the method of wood engraving, whereby, with 3 blocks, giving the middle values, the lights, and the shadows, it is possible to imitate drawings in chiaroscuro, which was certainly a thing of beautiful and fanciful invention. And from this also there afterwards came an abundance of prints, as will be related with greater detail in the life of Marcantonio Bolognese. Raffaello then painted for the monastery of the monks of Monte Oliveto, called Santa Maria dello Spasmo at Palermo, a panel picture of Christ bearing the cross, which is held to be a marvelous work. In this may be seen the impious ministers of the crucifixion, leading him with wrath and fury to his death on Mount Calvary, and Christ, broken with agony at the near approach of death, has fallen to the ground under the weight of the tree of the cross, and bathed with sweat and blood, turns toward the Maries, who are in a storm of weeping. Moreover, there is seen among them Veronica, who stretches out her arms and offers him a cloth, with an expression of the tenderest love, not to mention that the work is full of men-at-arms, both on horseback and on foot, who are pouring forth from the gate of Jerusalem with the standards of justice in their hands, in various most beautiful attitudes. This panel, when completely finished, but not yet brought to its resting place, was very near coming to an evil end, for the story goes that after it had been put on shipboard, in order that it might be carried to Palermo, a terrible storm dashed against a rock the ship that was carrying it, in such a manner that the timbers broke asunder, and all the men were lost, together with the merchandise, save only the panel, which, safely packed in its case, was washed by the sea onto the shore of Genoa. There, having been fished up and drawn to land, it was found to be a thing divine, and was put into safe keeping, for it had remained undamaged and without any hurt or blemish, since even the fury of the winds and the waves of the sea had respect for the beauty of such a work. The news of this being then bruited abroad, the monks took measures to recover it, and no sooner had it been restored to them by the favor of the Pope, that they gave satisfaction, and that liberally, to those who had rescued it. Thereupon it was once more put on board ship, and brought at last to Sicily, where they set it up in Palermo, in which place it has more fame and reputation than the Mount of Vulcan itself. While Raffaello was engaged on these works, which having to gratify great and distinguished persons, he could not refuse to undertake, not to mention that his own private interests prevented him from saying them nay, yet for all this he never ceased to carry on the series of pictures that he had begun in the papal apartments and halls, wherein he always kept men who pursued the work from his own designs, while he himself, continually supervising everything, lent to so vast an enterprise the aid of the best efforts of which he was capable. No long time passed, therefore, before he threw open that apartment of the Borgia Tower, in which he had painted a scene on every wall, 2 above the windows and 2 others on the unbroken walls. In one was the burning of the Borgo Vecchio of Rome, when all other methods having failed to put out the fire, Saint Leo IV presents himself at the loggia of his palace and extinguishes it completely with his benediction. In this scene are represented various perils. On one side are women who are bearing vessels filled with water in their hands and on their heads, whereby to extinguish the flames, and their hair and draperies are blown about by the terrible fury of a tempestuous wind. Others, who are seeking to throw water on the fire, are blinded by the smoke and wholly bewildered. On the other side, after the manner of Virgil's story of Anchises being carried by Aeneas, is shown an old sick man overcome by his infirmity and the flames of the fire, and in the figure of the young man are seen courage and strength and great effort in all his limbs under the weight of the old man who lies helpless on the young man's back. He is followed by an old woman with bare feet and disordered garments, who is flying from the fire, and a little naked boy runs before them. On the top of some ruins, likewise, may be seen a naked woman with hair all disheveled, who has her child in her hands and is throwing him to a man of her house, who, having escaped from the flames, is standing in the street on tiptoe, with arms outstretched to receive the child wrapped in swathing bands. Wherein the eager anxiety of the woman to save her son may be recognized no less clearly than her torment in the peril of the fierce flames, which are already licking around her feet. And no less suffering is evident in him who is receiving the child, both for its sake and on account of his own fear of death. Nor is it possible to describe the imagination that this most ingenious and most marvelous craftsman showed in a mother with her feet bare, her garments in disorder, her girdle unbound, and her hair disheveled, who has gathered her children before her and is driving them on, holding part of her clothing in one hand, that they may escape from the ruins and from that blazing furnace, not to mention that there are also some women who, kneeling before the Pope, appear to be praying to His Holiness that he should make the fire cease. The next scene is from the life of the same Saint Leo IV, wherein Raffaello, depicting the port of Ostia, occupied by the fleet of the Turks, who had come to take the Pope prisoner. The Christians may be seen fighting against that fleet on the sea, and already there has come to the harbor an endless number of prisoners who are disembarking from a boat and being dragged by the beard by some soldiers who are very beautiful in features and most spirited in their attitudes. The prisoners, dressed in the motley garb of galley slaves, are being led before St. Leo, whose figure is a portrait of Pope Leo X. Here Raffaello painted His Holiness in pontificals between Cardinal Santa Maria in Portico, who was Bernardo de Vizzo of Bibbiena, and Cardinal Giulio de' Medici, who afterwards became Pope Clement. Nor is it possible to describe in detail the beautiful conceptions that this most ingenious craftsman showed in the expressions of the prisoners, wherein one can recognize without speech their grief and the fear of death. In the first of the other 2 scenes is Pope Leo X consecrating the most Christian king, Francis I of France, chanting the Mass in his pontificals and blessing the oil for the anointing of the king, and likewise the royal crown. There, besides the great number of cardinals and bishops in their robes who are assisting, he portrayed from life many ambassadors and other persons, and also some figures dressed in the French fashion according to the style of that time. In the other scene, he painted the crowning of the same king, wherein are portraits from life of the Pope and of Francis, one in armor, and the other in his pontificals. Besides which, all the cardinals, bishops, chamberlains, esquires, and grooms of the chamber are seated in due order in their places, as is the custom in the chapel, all in their robes and portrayed from life, among them being Giannozzo Pandolfini, Bishop of Troia, a close friend of Raffaello, with many others who were distinguished at that time. Near the king is a little boy kneeling who is holding the royal crown, a portrait of Ippolito de' Medici, who afterwards became cardinal and vice-chancellor, a man of great repute, and much the friend not only of this art, but of all others, to whose blessed memory I acknowledge a vast obligation, seeing that my first steps, such as they were taken under his auspices. It is not possible to write of every detail in the works of this craftsman, wherein every least thing, although dumb, appears to have speech, save only of the bases executed below these pictures, with various figures of defenders and benefactors of the church, and various terminal figures on either side of them, the whole being wrought in such a manner that everything reveals spirit, feeling, and thought, and with such a harmony and unity of coloring that nothing better can be conceived. And since the ceiling of that apartment had been painted by Pietro Perugino, his master, Raffaello would not destroy it, moved by respect for his memory and by the love that he bore to the man who had been the origin of the rank that he held in his art. Such was the greatness of this master that he kept designers all over Italy, at Pozzuolo, and even in Greece, and he was forever searching out everything of the good that might help his art. Now, continuing his work, he also painted a hall wherein were some figures of the apostles and other saints and tabernacles executed in terretta, and there he caused to be made by Giovanni da Udine, his disciple, who has no equal in the painting of animals, all the animals that Pope Leo possessed, such as the chameleon, the civet cats, the apes, the parrots, the lions, the elephants, and other beasts even more strange. And besides embellishing the palace greatly with grotesques and varied pavements, he also gave the designs for the papal staircases, as well as for the loggie, begun by the architect Bramante, but left unfinished on account of his death, and afterwards carried out with the new design and architecture of Raffaello, who made for this a model of wood, with better proportion and adornment than had been accomplished by Bramante. The Pope, wishing to demonstrate the greatness and magnificence of his generous ambition, Raffaello made the designs for the ornaments in stucco and for the scenes that were painted there, and likewise for the compartments, and as for the stucco and the grotesques, he placed at the head of that work Giovanni da Udine, and the figures he entrusted to Giulio Romano, although that master worked but little at them, and he also employed Giovanni Francesco, il Bologna, Perino del Vaga, Pellegrino da Modena, Vincenzo da San Gimignano, and Polidoro da Caravaggio, with many other painters, who executed scenes and figures and other things that were required throughout that work, which Raffaello caused to be completed with such perfection, that he even sent to Florence for pavements by the hand of Luca della Robbia. Wherefore it is certain that with regard to the paintings, the stucco ornaments, the arrangement, or any of the beautiful inventions, no one would be able to execute or even to imagine a more marvelous work, and its beauty was the reason that Raffaello received the charge of all the works of painting and architecture that were in progress in the palace. It is said that the courtesy of Raffaello was such that he prevailed upon the masons, in order that he might accommodate his friends, not to build the walls absolutely solid and unbroken, but to leave above the old rooms below various openings and spaces for the storage of barrels, flasks, and wood, which holes and spaces so weakened the lower part of the masonry that afterwards they had to be filled in, because the whole was beginning to show cracks. He commissioned Gian Barile to adorn all the doors and ceilings of woodwork, with a good number of carvings, which he executed and finished with beautiful grace. He gave the architectural design for the Vigna of the Pope, footnote, Villa Madama, end footnote, and for many houses in the Borgo, in particular for the palace of Messer Giovanni Battista dall'Aquila, which was a very beautiful work. He also designed one for the Bishop of Troia, who had it built in the Via di San Gallo at Florence. For the Black Friars of San Sisto in Piacenza, he painted the picture for their high altar, containing the Madonna with Saint Sisto and Saint Barbara, a truly rare and extraordinary work. He executed many pictures to be sent into France, and in particular for the king, a Saint Michael fighting with the devil, which was held to be a marvelous thing. In this work he painted a fire-scarred rock to represent the center of the earth, from the fissures of which are issuing the sulphurous flames, and in Lucifer, whose scorched and burned limbs are painted with various tints of flesh color, could be seen all the shades of anger that his venomous and swollen pride calls up against him who overbears the greatness of him who is deprived of any kingdom where there might be peace, and doomed to suffer perpetual punishment. The opposite may be perceived in the Saint Michael, clad in armor of iron and gold, who, although he is painted with a celestial air, yet has valor, force, and terror in his aspect, and has already thrown Lucifer down and hurled him backwards with his spear. In a word, this work was of such a kind that he won for it, and rightly, a most honorable award from that king. He made portraits of Beatrice of Ferrara and other ladies, and in particular that of his own mistress, with an endless number of others. Raffaello was a very amorous person, delighting much in women, and ever ready to serve them, which was the reason that, in the pursuit of his carnal pleasures, he found his friends more complacent and indulgent toward him than perchance was right. Wherefore, when his dear friend Agostino Chigi commissioned him to paint the first loggia in his palace, Raffaello was not able to give much attention to his work on account of the love that he had for his mistress, at which Agostino fell into such despair that he so contrived, by means of others, by himself, and in other ways, as to bring it about, although only with difficulty, that this lady should come to live continually with Raffaello in that part of the house where he was working. And in this manner the work was brought to completion. For this work he made all the cartoons, and he colored many of the figures in fresco with his own hand. And on the ceiling he made the Council of the Gods in Heaven, wherein in the forms of the gods are seen many vestments and lineaments copied from the antique, and executed with very beautiful grace and draftsmanship. In like manner he made the Marriage of Psyche, with ministers serving Jove, and the Graces scattering flowers over the table. In the spandrels of the vaulting he executed many scenes, in one of which is Mercury with his flute, who, as he flies, has all the appearance of descending from heaven, and in another is Jove with an air of celestial dignity, kissing Ganymede, and in another, likewise, lower down, is the car of Venus and the Graces, with Mercury drawing Psyche up to heaven, with many other scenes from the poets in the other spandrels. And in the spherical triangles of the vaulting above the arches, between the spandrels, are many most beautiful little boys in foreshortening, hovering in the air and carrying all the instruments of the gods. Jove's lightnings and thunderbolts, the helmet, sword, and shield of Mars, Vulcan's hammers, the club, and the lion's skin of Hercules, the caduceus of Mercury, Pan's pipes, and the agricultural rakes of Vertumnus. All are accompanied by animals appropriate to their character, and the whole work, both as picture and as poem, is truly beautiful. Round these scenes he caused Giovanni da Udine to make a border of all kinds of flowers, foliage, and fruits, in festoons which are as beautiful as they could be. Raffaello made the designs for the architecture of the stables of the Chigi, and the design for the chapel of the aforesaid Agostino in Santa Maria del Popolo, wherein, besides painting it, he made arrangements for the erection of a marvelous tomb, causing Lorenzetto, a sculptor of Florence, to execute 2 figures, which are still in his house, in the Macello dei Corpi at Rome. But the death of Raffaello, followed by that of Agostino, brought it about that this work was given to Sebastiano Viniziano. Meanwhile, Raffaello had risen to such greatness that Leo X ordained that he should set to work on the great hall on the upper floor, wherein are the victories of Constantine, and with this he made a beginning. A fancy likewise took the Pope to have some very rich tapestries made in gold and floss silk, whereupon Raffaello drew and colored with his own hand, of the exact form and size, all the cartoons which were sent to Flanders to be woven, and the tapestries, when finished, were brought to Rome. This work was executed so marvelously that it arouses astonishment in whoever beholds it, wondering how it could have been possible to weave the hair and beards in such detail, and to give softness to the flesh with mere threads. And it is truly rather a miracle than the work of human art, seeing that in these tapestries are animals, water, and buildings, all made in such a way that they seem to be not woven, but really wrought with the brush. The work cost 70,000 crowns, and it is still preserved in the Papal Chapel. For Cardinal Colonna, he painted a St. John on canvas, for which, on account of its beauty, that cardinal had an extraordinary love. But, happening to be attacked by illness, he was asked by Messer Jacopo da Carpi, the physician who cured him, to give it to him as a present. And because of this desire of Messer Jacopo, to whom he felt himself very deeply indebted, he gave it up. It is now in the possession of Francesco Benintendi in Florence. For Giulio de' Medici, Cardinal and Vice-Chancellor, he painted a panel picture to be sent into France of the Transfiguration of Christ, at which he labored without ceasing, and brought it to the highest perfection with his own hand. In this scene, he represented Christ transfigured on Mount Tabor, at the foot of which are the 11 disciples awaiting him. There may be seen a young man possessed by a spirit, who has been brought thither in order that Christ, after descending from the mountain, may deliver him, which young man stretches himself out in a distorted attitude, crying and rolling his eyes, and reveals his suffering in his flesh, his veins, and the beat of his pulse, all infected by that malignant spirit, and the color of his flesh as he makes those violent and fearsome gestures is very pale. This figure is supported by an old man who, having embraced them and taken heart, with his eyes wide open and the light shining in them, is raising his brows and wrinkling his forehead, showing at one and the same time both strength and fear. Gazing intently, however, at the apostles, he appears to be encouraging himself by trusting in them. Among many women is one, the principal figure in that panel, who, having knelt down before the apostles and turning her head toward them, stretches her arms in the direction of the maniac and points out his misery. Besides which, the apostles, some standing, some seated, and others kneeling, show that they are moved to very great compassion by such misfortune. And indeed, he made therein figures and heads so fine in their novelty and variety, to say nothing of their extraordinary beauty, that it is the common opinion of all craftsmen that this work, among the vast number that he painted, is the most glorious, the most lovely, and the most divine. For whoever wishes to know how Christ transfigured and made divine should be represented in painting must look at this work, wherein Raffaello made him in perspective over that mount in a sky of exceeding brightness, with Moses and Elias, who, illuminated by a dazzling splendor, burst into life in his light. Prostrate on the ground, in attitudes of great beauty and variety, are Peter, James, and John. One has his head to the earth, and another, shading his eyes with his hands, is defending himself from the rays and intense light of the splendor of Christ. He, clothed in snow-white raiment, with his arms outstretched and his head raised, appears to reveal the divine essence and nature of all the three persons united and concentrated in himself by the perfect art of Raffaello, who seems to have summoned up all his powers in such a manner in order to show the supreme force of his art in the countenance of Christ, that, after finishing this, the last work that he was to do, he never again touched a brush, being overtaken by death. Now, having described the works of this most excellent craftsman, before I come to relate other particulars of his life and death, I do not wish to grudge the labor of saying something for the benefit of the men of our arts about the various manners of Raffaello. He, then, after having imitated in his boyhood the manner of his master Pietro Perugino, which he made much better in draughtsmanship, coloring, and invention, believed that he had done enough, and he recognized when he had reached a riper age that he was still too far from the truth. But after seeing the works of Leonardo da Vinci, who had no peer in the expressions of heads, both of men and of women, and surpassing all other painters in giving grace and movement to his figures, he was left marveling and amazed, and, in a word, the manner of Leonardo pleasing him much more than any other that he had ever seen. He set himself to study it, and abandoning, little by little, although with great difficulty, the manner of Pietro, he sought to the best of his power and knowledge to imitate that of Leonardo. But for all his diligence and study, in certain difficulties, he was never able to surpass Leonardo, and although it appears to many that he did surpass him in sweetness and in a kind of natural facility, nevertheless he was by no means superior to him in that sublime groundwork of conceptions and that grandeur of art in which few have been the peers of Leonardo. Yet Raffaello came very near to him, more than any other painter, and above all in grace of coloring. But to return to Raffaello himself, in time he found himself very much hindered and impeded by the manner that he had adopted from Pietro when he was quite young, which he acquired with ease, since it was over-precise, dry, and feeble in draughtsmanship. His being unable to forget it was the reason that he had great difficulty in learning the beauties of the nude and the methods of difficult foreshortenings from the cartoon that Michelangelo Buonarroti made for the council hall in Florence, and another might have lost heart, believing that he had been previously wasting his time, and would never have achieved, however lofty his genius, what Raffaello accomplished. But he, having purged himself of Pietro's manner, and having thoroughly freed himself of it, in order to learn the manner of Michelangelo, so full of difficulties in every part, was changed, as it were, from a master once again into a disciple, and he forced himself with incredible study, when already a man, to do in a few months what might have called for the tender age at which all things are best acquired, and for a space of many years. For in truth, he who does not learn in good time right principles and the manner that he wishes to follow, and does not proceed little by little to solve the difficulties of the arts by means of experience, seeking to understand every part and to put it into practice, can scarcely ever become perfect, and even if he does, that can only be after a longer space of time and much greater labor. When Raffaello resolved to set himself to change and improve his manner, he had never given his attention to nudes with that zealous study which is necessary, and had only drawn them from life in the manner that he had seen practiced by his master Pietro, imparting to them the grace that he had from nature. He then devoted himself to studying the nude and to comparing the muscles of anatomical subjects and of flayed human bodies with those of the living, which, being covered with skin, are not clearly defined as they are when the skin has been removed, and going on to observe in what way they acquire the softness of flesh in the proper places, and how certain graceful flexures are produced by changing the point of view, and also the effect of inflating, lowering, or raising either a limb or the whole person, and likewise the concatenation of the bones, nerves, and veins, he became excellent in all the points that are looked for in a painter of eminence. Knowing, however, that in this respect he could never attain to the perfection of Michelangelo, he reflected like a man of supreme judgment that painting does not consist only in representing the nude human form, but has a wider field, that one can enumerate among the perfect painters those who express historical inventions well and with facility, and who show fine judgment in their fancies, and that he who, in the composition of scenes, can make them neither confused with too much detail, nor poor with too little, but distributed with beautiful invention and order, may also be called an able and judicious craftsman. To this, as Raffaello was well aware, may be added the enriching those scenes with a bizarre variety of perspectives, buildings, and landscapes, the method of clothing figures gracefully, the making them fade away sometimes in the shadows, and sometimes come forward into the light, the imparting of life and beauty to the heads of women, children, young men, and old, and the giving them movement and boldness according to necessity. He considered also how important is the furious flight of horses in battles, fierceness in soldiers, the knowledge how to depict all sorts of animals, and above all, the power to give such resemblance to portraits that they seem to be alive and that it is known whom they represent, with an endless number of other things, such as the adornment of draperies, footwear, helmets, armor, women's headdresses, hair, beards, vases, trees, grottos, rocks, fires, skies turbid and serene, clouds, rain, lightning, clear weather, night, the light of the moon, the splendor of the sun, and innumerable other things which are called for every moment by the requirements of the art of painting. Pondering over these things, I say, Raffaello resolved, since he could not approach Michelangelo in that branch of art to which he had set his hand to seek to equal, and perchance to surpass him in these others, and he devoted himself, therefore, not to imitating the manner of that master, but to the attainment of a catholic excellence in the other fields of art that have been described. And if the same had been done by many craftsmen of our own age, who, having determined to pursue the study of Michelangelo's works alone, have failed to imitate him, and have not been able to reach his extraordinary perfection, they would not have labored in vain, nor acquired a manner so hard, so full of difficulty, wanting in beauty and coloring, and poor in invention, but would have been able, by aiming at catholicity and at imitation in the other fields of art, to render service both to themselves and to the world. Raffaello, then, having made this resolution, and having recognized that Fra Bartolomeo di San Marco had a passing good method of painting, well-grounded draftsmanship, and a pleasing manner of coloring, although at times, in order to obtain stronger relief, he made too much use of darks, took from him what appeared to him to suit his need and his fancy, namely, a middle course, both in drawing and in coloring, and mingling with that method certain others selected from the best work of other masters. Out of many manners he made one, which was looked upon ever afterwards as his own, and which was and always will be vastly esteemed by all craftsmen. This was then seen perfected in the Sibyls and Prophets of the work that he executed, as has been related, in Santa Maria della Pace, in the carrying out of which work he was greatly assisted by having seen the paintings of Michelangelo in the chapel of the Pope. And if Raffaello had remained content with this same manner, and had not sought to give it more grandeur and variety, in order to prove that he had as good a knowledge of the nude as Michelangelo, he would not have lost a part of the good name that he had acquired. But the nudes that he made in that apartment of the Borgia Tower, where there is the burning of the Borgo, although they are fine, are not in every way excellent. In like manner, Those that were painted likewise by him on the ceiling of the palace of Agostino Chigi in the Trastevere did not give complete satisfaction, for they were wanting in that grace and sweetness which were peculiar to Raffaello, the reason of which, in great part, was the circumstance that he had them colored by others after his design. However, repenting of this error, like a man of judgment, he resolved afterwards to execute by himself, without assistance from others, the panel picture of the Transfiguration of Christ that is in San Pietro a Montorio, wherein are all those qualities which, as has already been described, are looked for and required in a good picture. And if he had not employed in this work, as it were, from caprice, printer's smoke black, the nature of which, as has been remarked many times, is to become ever darker with time, to the injury of the other colors with which it is mixed, I believe that the picture would still be as fresh as when he painted it, whereas it now appears to be rather a mass of shadows than aught else. I have thought fit, almost at the close of this life, to make this discourse, in order to show with what labor, study, and diligence this honored craftsman always pursued his art, and even more for the sake of other painters, to the end that they may learn how to avoid those hindrances from which the wisdom and genius of Raffaello were able to deliver him. I must add this as well, that every man should be satisfied and contented with doing that work to which he feels himself drawn by a natural inclination, and should not seek out of emulation to put his hand to that for which nature has not adapted him. For otherwise he will labor in vain, and often to his own shame and loss. Moreover, where striving is enough, no man should aim at super-striving. Footnote: the use of this word, though perhaps too modern, seems to the translator to be the only way to preserve the play of words in the text. End footnote. Merely in order to surpass those who by some great gift of nature, or by some special grace bestowed on them by God, have performed or are performing miracles in art, for the reason that he who is not suited to any particular work can never reach, let him labor as he may, the goal to which another, with the assistance of nature, has attained with ease. Of this among the old craftsmen we may see an example in Paolo Uccello, who, striving against the limitations of his powers in order to advance, did nothing but go backwards. The same has been done in our own day, no long time since, by Jacopo da Pontormo, and it has been proved by the experience of many others, as we have shown before, and will point out yet again. And this perchance happens because heaven always distributes its favors, to the end that every man may rest content with that which falls to him. But now, having discoursed on these matters of art, perchance at greater length than was needful, let us return to the life and death of Raffaello. He had a strait friendship with Cardinal Bernardo de Vizzo of Bibbiena, who had importuned him for many years to take a wife of his choosing, and Raffaello, while not directly refusing to obey the wishes of the cardinal, had yet put the matter off, saying that he would rather wait till 3 or 4 years had passed. This term came upon Raffaello when he was not expecting it, and he was reminded by the cardinal of his promise, whereupon, seeing himself bound, like the courteous man that he was, he could not break his word, and thus accepted as his wife a niece of that cardinal. And because he was always very ill content with this entanglement, he continued to delay the matter in such a way that many months passed without the marriage being brought to pass. But it was with no dishonorable motive that he did this, for having been so many years in the service of the court, and being the creditor of Leo for a good sum, it had been hinted to him that when the hall on which he was engaged was finished, the Pope proposed to reward him for his labors and abilities by giving him a red hat, of which he had already determined to distribute a good number, and some of them to men of less merit than Raffaello. Meanwhile, pursuing his amours in secret, Raffaello continued to divert himself beyond measure with the pleasures of love, whence it happened that, having on one occasion indulged in more than his usual excess, he returned to his house in a violent fever. The physicians, therefore, believing that he had overheated himself, and receiving from him no confession of the excess of which he had been guilty, imprudently bled him, insomuch that he was weakened and felt himself sinking, for he was in need rather of restoratives. Thereupon he made his will, and first, like a good Christian, he sent his mistress out of the house, leaving her the means to live honourably. Next, he divided his possessions among his disciples, Giulio Romano, whom he had always loved dearly, and the Florentine Giovanni Francesco, called Il Fattore, with a priest of Urbino, his kinsman, whose name I do not know. Then he gave orders that some of his wealth should be used for restoring with new masonry one of the ancient tabernacles in Santa Maria Ritonda, and for making an altar with a marble statue of Our Lady in that church, which he chose as his own place of repose and burial after death, and he left all the rest to Giulio and Giovanni Francesco, appointing as executor of his will Messer Baldassare da Pescia, then datary to the Pope. Finally, he confessed and was penitent, and ended the course of his life at the age of 37, on the same day that he was born, which was Good Friday. And even as he embellished the world with his talents, so it may be believed does his soul adorn heaven by its presence. As he lay dead in the hall where he had been working, there was placed at his head the picture of the Transfiguration, which he had executed for Cardinal de' Medici, and the sight of that living picture, in contrast with the dead body, caused the hearts of all who beheld it to burst with sorrow. That work, in memory of the loss of Raffaello, was placed by the cardinal on the high altar of San Pietro a Montorio, and on account of the nobility of his every action, it was held ever afterwards in great estimation. His body received that honourable burial which his noble spirit had deserved, for there was no craftsman who did not weep with sorrow and follow him to the grave. His death was also a great grief to the whole court of the Pope, first because he had held in his lifetime the office of groom of the chamber, and likewise because he had been so dear to the Pope that his loss caused him to weep bitterly. O happy and blessed spirit, in that every man is glad to speak of thee, to celebrate thy actions, and to admire every drawing that thou didst leave to us. When this noble craftsman died, the art of painting might well have died also, seeing that when he closed his eyes, she was left, as it were, blind. And now for us, who have survived him, it remains to imitate the good, nay, the supremely excellent method bequeathed to us by him as a pattern, and as is called for by his merit, and our obligations, to hold a most grateful remembrance of this in our minds, and to pay the highest honour to his memory with our lips. For in truth, we have from him art, colouring, and invention harmonized and brought to such a pitch of perfection as could scarcely be hoped for, nor may any intellect ever think to surpass him. And in addition to this benefit that he conferred on art, like a true friend to her, as long as he lived, he never ceased to show how one should deal with great men, with those of middle station, and with the lowest. And indeed, among his extraordinary gifts, I perceive one of such value that I, for my part, am amazed at it, in that heaven gave him the power to produce in our art an effect wholly contrary to the nature of us painters, which was that our craftsmen, I do not mean only the lesser, but also those whose humour it was to be great persons, and of this humour art creates a vast number, while working in company with Raffaello, felt themselves naturally united and in such accord that all evil humours vanished at the sight of him, and every vile and base thought fell away from their minds. Such unity was never greater at any other time than his, and this happened because they were overcome both by his courtesy and by his art, and even more by the good disposition of his nature, which was so full of gentleness and so overflowing with loving kindness that it was seen that the very animals, not to speak of men, honored him. It is said that if any painter who knew him, and even any who did not know him, asked him for some drawing that he needed, Raffaello would leave his own work in order to assist him. And he always kept a vast number of them employed, aiding them and teaching them with such a love as might have been the due rather of his own children than of fellow craftsmen, for which reason he was never seen to go to court without having with him, as he left his house, some 50 painters, all able and excellent, who kept him company in order to do him honor. In short, he lived not like a painter, but like a prince. Wherefore, O art of painting, thou couldst then esteem thyself indeed most blessed in possessing a craftsman who, both with his genius and his virtues, exalted thee higher than heaven. Truly happy mightst thou call thyself, in that thy disciples, following in the footsteps of so great a man, have seen how life should be lived, and how important is the union of art and virtue, which, wedded in Raffaello, had strength to prevail on the magnificent Julius II and the magnanimous Leo X, exalted as they were in rank and dignity, to make him their most intimate friend, and show him all possible generosity, insomuch that by their favour and by the wealth that they bestowed upon him, he was enabled to do vast honour both to himself and to art. Blessed also may be called all those who employed in his service worked under him, since whoever imitated him found that he had reached an honourable haven. And in like manner, all those who imitate his labours in art will be honoured by the world, even as, by resembling him in uprightness of life, they will win rewards from heaven. Raffaello received from Bembo the following epitaph: Deo optimo maximo, Raffaelli sanctio, Johannis filio urbinati, pictori eminentissimo, veterumque aemulo, cujus spiranteis prope imagineis si contemplere, naturae atque artis foedus facile insperexeris. Julii secundi et Leonis decimi, pontificum maximorum, picturae et architecturae operibus gloriam auxit, vixit annos 37 integer integros, quo die natus est, eo esse deseit. Octavo idus aprilis, millesimo quingentesimo vicesimo. Ille hic est Raphael, timoit quo sospite vinci, rerum magna paranzet, moriente mori. And Count Baldassare Castiglione wrote of his death in the following manner: Quad lacerem corpus medica sana verit arte, her politam stugiis et revocaret aquis. Ad stugias ipse est, raptus epidaurius undas, sic precium vitae mors fuit artifici. Tu quoque dum toto laniatum corpore Romam, componis miro, Raphael ingenio. Atque urbis laceram fero, igni anisque cadaver, ad vitam antiquaam, iam revocasque decus. Mo visti superam invidiam, indignataque mors est, te derum extinctis, redere posse animam. Et quad longa dies paulatim aboluerat hoc te, mortalis preta lege parare iterum. Sic misereu prima cadis intercepte juventa, debere et morti nostraque nosque mones.